unfold.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take the sources you share and go right to the core of the knowledge.
Today we are really getting into something heavy.
We really are. We're dissecting one of the most famous, and I think it's fair to say, one of the most harrowing experiments in the history of psychology.
Yeah.
The Milgram obedience studies.
That's exactly the mission. And we want to go beyond just the headline number, the 65% figure that everyone knows.
Right.
We want to analyze this thing as what it really was, a high-stakes psychological and philosophical thriller that played out in a Yale basement starting in 1961.
The goal here is to get at the why, not just what happened, but that agonizing internal conflict inside the participants.
And the context is everything. I mean, you can't understand this in a vacuum. Milgram's first studies, his pilot studies, they began just 3 months after the world was glued to the opening of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem.
So this is happening in real time. History and psychology are just colliding.
Absolutely. The whole world was asking, how is the Holocaust possible? People were looking for monsters, for explanations, and Milgram, in his lab, he was about to offer this alternative and profoundly disturbing answer.
An answer that suggested that the capacity for this kind of thing isn't just in monsters. It's built into, our social structures.
Exactly. That ordinary people can become cogs in a destructive machine when the situation demands it.
And here's the number that just underpins this whole deep dive. 65% of participants in that first main study were willing to administer the maximum, what they believed was a potentially lethal electric shock of 450 volts.
And they did just because a man in a gray lab coat told them to continue?
Just because he told them to. But if you look closer, and this is what we need to get into, that statistic is just the starting point.
It's not the conclusion at all. The real story, the real insight, is in the incredible distress that went along with the compliance. I mean, you're talking about people sweating, trembling, stuttering.
There was nervous laughter. People begging the experimenter to let them stop.
Yes, they were completely trapped. Trapped between this powerful moral command, do not harm this innocent person, and an even more powerful social one, you must obey authority.
And that tension, that unbearable contradiction between your own conscience and your need to comply, that's the key. That's what we need to unlock today.
How do you get a person to flip that final switch when every fiber of their being is screaming at them to stop?
That's the question.
So to really get Milgram, you have to rewind a little bit to the philosophical crisis after the war. The big question, the one that was just dominating intellectual life, was how could a modern civilized nation like Germany orchestrate a systematic mass extermination?
And the assumption was it had to be something truly evil, something pathological.
Right. You were looking for profound wickedness, a level of hatred that was just off the charts. And when the Eichmann trial started in April 1961, the world was waiting for that monster to finally be put on display.
This is Adolf Eichmann, the logistical architect of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
The man who organized the trains.
He was the guy who made the trains run on time to the death camps. So the media, the public, everyone was expecting, a Shakespearean villain.
Like an Iago or a Macbeth.
Exactly. Someone who's evil, whose fanaticism would just be pouring off of him. A textbook sadist that you could easily identify and say, okay, that's an aberration. That's not us.
But that is not what happened. And the narrative that came out, mostly through the reporting of the political theorist Hannah Arendt for The New Yorker, was completely different.
And arguably far more unsettling. She was there. She was in the courtroom watching him, listening to him day after day.
And what did she see?
Her observation was revolutionary. She described Eichmann not as some kind of demon, but as terrifyingly normal. He was a functionary, a bureaucrat. And her defining insight came down to that famous phrase, the banality of evil.
So when Arendt says banality, is she saying he was just incompetent? Or that what he did was somehow ordinary?
No, it's something much more subtle and frankly, much more disturbing. She argued his evil didn't come from some deep-seated wickedness or a bloodlust for murder. It came from profound thoughtlessness. Gedankenlosigkeit, as she put it. A rote adherence to duty and procedure. She saw him as being driven by, of all things, a mundane desire for career advancement. He wasn't focused on the moral horror of extermination. He was focused on the logistics, the train schedules, the quotas, making the process efficient.
So he just turned this unimaginable horror into a series of technical problems that needed to be solved.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He was operating under this imperative of absolute obedience to the Führer's law, which in his mind was the only source of morality. He was the paper pusher, the Schrecktäter, the desk murderer. The villain wasn't the tyrant, it was the unthinking servant of the system.
Okay, so that's the intellectual framework. That ordinary people just doing their jobs, focused on process over consequence, could commit genocide. And this is where Milgram comes in.
He steps right into that. He's taking Arendt's philosophical idea and he's turning it into an empirical test.
He was directly inspired by her work.
Oh, explicitly. He wrote in his book, Obedience to Authority, that Arendt's concept comes closer to the truth than one might dare to imagine. He saw his participants, these ordinary Americans, postmen, clerks, teachers. He saw them as mirrors of those desk murderers.
They had no personal hatred for the person they were shocking.
None at all. But the structural requirements of the lab demanded that they comply. They were, in a sense, the American version of the Schreibtischtäter, detached from the consequences by the institutional setup.
That's a powerful and, a really direct link. Now, we do have to acknowledge there's been some modern pushback on Arendt.
There has been.
Researchers like Bettina Stangneth have found evidence that suggests Eichmann was actually much more of an ideologue, a committed anti-Semite who really gloried in his work. So if Eichmann really was a fanatic, does that kind of undermine the whole banality of evil idea?
Well, it definitely complicates the historical picture of Eichmann the man. But, and this is the critical point, it doesn't invalidate Arendt's psychological concept, especially not in the context of Milgram.
How so?
Because the crucial insight is this. Whether or not Eichmann himself was a fanatic, the subjects in Milgram's lab absolutely were not. They were just regular people from New Haven, paid a few dollars to be in a memory study. They were clearly, demonstrably distressed by what they were doing.
So what Milgram proved is that fanaticism isn't a prerequisite for atrocity.
Exactly. The real shock of the experiment was that the villain isn't always a person. Often it's the situation. It's the set of pressures that just deny personal choice. He proved that most people, if you put them in the right kind of bad barrel, they'll comply, even when their own conscience is screaming that it's wrong. And that is the lasting power of the banality concept in psychology.
Okay, so if the goal was to override a person's conscience, Milgram knew he couldn't just, ask people to shock strangers. He had to build a world, a stage.
A stage that manufactured a new reality. A reality where obedience wasn't just an option, it was the logical, socially required path. The sources all describe the experiment's power as lying in its dramaturgical precision.
It was theater.
It was a carefully constructed piece of theater designed to trap the subject in a kind of social contract of obligation.
Okay, so let's break down that stagecraft. What were the key elements?
Well, you have to start with the setting, Yale's prestige. The subjects show up at the Yale Interaction Laboratory, and you have to imagine the environment is elegant, it's academic, it's intimidating. It immediately lends this immense, almost religious legitimacy to what's about to happen.
So you immediately feel small. You feel subordinate to this big idea of science with a capital S.
Absolutely. The experimenter is cloaked in the authority of Yale, and you've been told you're contributing to a very important study on memory. And the sources even detail the theatrical elements, like the one-way mirror. Milgram was literally directing this play, watching every hesitation.
And the cast of characters. Let's start with the authority figure, the experimenter.
This was a man named John Jack Williams. He was a high school biology teacher, and Milgram chose him specifically for what he called his natural authority. He was tall, he could project this impassive, stern demeanor, and crucially, he wore a gray lab coat.
A gray one? Why gray and not white? That seems like a small detail.
It's a huge detail. A white coat suggests a doctor, a healer, someone bound by the Hippocratic Oath. Benign. The gray coat, as the sources suggest, it implied something else. A technician. A cold, efficient bureaucrat of science.
It aligns perfectly with Arendt's idea of the detached functionary.
Perfectly. Williams was told to remain strictly professional, emotionally neutral. He was the embodiment of the very thoughtlessness that defined the banality of evil.
The perfect sterile machine to issue the orders. And who was the victim? The learner.
That was James McDonough, a 47-year-old accountant, and again, a careful choice. He was picked for his mild, everyman appearance. The subject was supposed to look at him and see themselves, or a neighbor. It grounded the situation in the ordinary.
And then the most important psychological trick, The role assignment for the teacher. Who was the actual naive participant?
Yes, the deception here was critical. The subject was led to believe that the roles teacher and learner were assigned randomly by drawing slips of paper from a hat.
But it was rigged.
It was completely rigged. Both slips said teacher. So the real participant always got the aggressive role, and McDonough, the Confederate, always became the victim. They were immediately locked into what they thought was a fair social contract.
So let's talk about the centerpiece of this whole theater, the simulated shock generator.
It was a masterpiece of psychological terror. It wasn't some flimsy prop. It was built to look intimidatingly professional, scientific. It had 30 prominent toggle switches, all in a neat line, escalating in 15-volt increments.
From 15 volts all the way up to 450.
Right. But the real psychological genius of the machine was the labels underneath the switches.
They weren't just numbers.
No, that's the key manipulation. The switches had verbal designations, forcing the teacher to consciously acknowledge the escalating violence. You start with slight shock, then you move through moderate shock, strong, very strong, intense, and extreme intensity shock.
So you couldn't pretend you didn't know what you were doing. You had to say it, in a sense, with every flip of a switch.
And then you get to the end of the board, the ultimate taboo. The final two switches, from 435 to 450 volts, were just labeled with 3 letters, XXX.
No description.
No rational description, just this symbol of ultimate finality, of a power level that was, beyond language. It forced the participant to confront this unspoken ultimate taboo.
And to make them believe this whole terrifying setup was real.
The single moment of genuine electricity was crucial. Before the experiment began, the teacher was given a sample shock of 45 volts.
A real one.
Oh yeah, a real one. The sources say it was genuinely painful, a sharp, undeniable jolt. And that one shock established the absolute visceral credibility of the entire machine. Once they felt that pain, they knew the stakes were real.
So the stage is set, the cast is in place, the procedure begins with the cover story.
The paired associate learning task. Simple memory test. The teacher reads word pairs, like blue box or nice day. The learner in the next room has to remember them. For every error, the teacher delivers a shock, escalating by one 15-volt switch each time.
The whole horror is just disguised as this mundane test. And the learner, McDonough, he was following a script, right? His reactions were synchronized to the voltage.
Exactly. It was a standardized protocol designed to systematically dismantle the teacher's psychological defenses, step by step.
So let's trace that path. Where does it start to go from routine to crisis?
Well, the early stages, up to around 75 volts, that's what you could call the banality phase. The learner just gives a little grunt, and the teacher sees it as routine, part of the process. At 120 volts, you get the first real verbal objection. Hey, this really hurts.
But the critical moment, the big plot twist, is at 150 volts. Why is that specific level considered the point of no return?
Because at 150 volts, the learner introduces a fatal new piece of information, his health. He cries out, ugh, experimenter, that's all, get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. I refuse to go on. Let me out.
So the stakes just went from pain to potential death.
Instantly. It's no longer just an experiment about learning. It's an explicit medical emergency, and the subject is forced to make a choice. Do I follow the abstract goal of science, or do I listen to this man with a known heart condition?
And the data shows that if they cross that 150-volt line, they're likely to go all the way.
Highly likely. It's the moment they commit. And as the shocks get worse, the scripted suffering becomes agonizing. At 270 volts, you're hearing agonized screams. The teacher is usually visibly shaking at this point, pleading with the experimenter.
Then at 300 volts, the victim stops participating.
Right. He shouts that he will no longer answer the questions. And this is a key bureaucratic moment. The experimenter's instruction is chilling. Treat silence as a wrong answer.
So you have to keep going. The system demands it.
The system demands it. And then comes the ultimate psychological weapon. At 330 volts, the learner gives one last hysterical scream, and then there is just prolonged, terrifying silence.
You're now shocking someone who is, for all you know, unconscious. Or worse.
Or dead.
Yeah.
And you're forced to confront the reality of your actions without even the relief of hearing an objection, just silence.
And the way the experimenter forced them to continue wasn't with threats. It was entirely linguistic.
Yeah.
These 4 prods.
Yes. The protocol of coercion, a sequence of standardized statements designed to appeal to the subject's commitment to the experiment, not to their fear.
So what's the first one?
Prod 1 is just a gentle nudge. Please continue, or please go on. Very polite. If that doesn't work, he escalates to the institutional goal. Prod 2. The experiment requires that you continue.
So now it's not about him, it's about the mission.
Exactly. Then Prod 3 makes it existential. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, the ultimate denial of free will. Prod 4. You have no other choice. You must go on.
The horror of that is that it frames the violence not as a choice you're making, but as an inevitable necessity, something the situation demands.
And they had a pre-scripted answer for every moral objection. If you worried about the pain, he'd say, although the shocks may be painful, there is no permanent tissue damage. If you said the learner wanted to stop, he'd say, whether the learner likes it or not, you must go on. The authority had an answer for everything. It just neutralized your conscience.
The high compliance rate, that 65%, it's so easy to assume those people were just indifferent. But they weren't.
They were absolutely not indifferent. They were trapped in this brutal internal war, and their bodies were screaming it. The observers behind the one-way mirror, their notes are chilling.
What were they actually seeing?
Extreme physical signs of conflict. Profuse sweating, intense trembling, stuttering. People were biting their lips until they bled, digging their fingernails into their own palms. They were literally using physical pain to try and distract from the psychological pain.
And the nervous laughter. The sources say 14 out of 40 subjects did this. That just seems so bizarre in that context.
It's a sign of a complete nervous system breakdown. It's what your brain does when it's faced with an unbearable contradiction. The moral command not to harm is slamming up against the social command to obey, and the whole system just short circuits.
It's a release valve.
A terrible one. And tragically, the sources confirm that 3 subjects had full-blown, uncontrollable seizures brought on entirely by the agony of this moral conflict.
That's the physical war. But the transcripts, they show us the intellectual war, this dialogue of despair, where they're trying to talk their way out of it. They're trying to negotiate with the devil.
They're trying to offload the responsibility without actually causing the social rupture of disobeying. They don't want to kill the man, but they also desperately don't want to disappoint the man in the gray coat.
Can you give us an example from the transcripts? The subject called Prosy seems to capture it perfectly.
Prosy's conflict is so clear. As the screams got worse, he's pleading. He's saying, I'm not going to kill that man in there. You hear him hollering. He can't stand it. I refuse to take the responsibility. He's in there hollering. He gets it. He sees the moral dimension.
That sounds like he's about to walk out. That's a moment of rebellion.
It should be. But then the experimenter just coolly delivers Prod 2. The experiment requires that you continue. And Prosy sits back down, composes himself, and keeps going. The system's command just overrode his moral argument.
And they tried to use the heart condition as a way out, right?
All the time. A subject named Mr. Brandt tried to argue logically. He told you he had a heart condition. I'm sorry, I don't want to be responsible for anything happening to him. They were actively trying to hand the moral burden back to the authority figure, hoping he would take it.
But he never did. And the most chilling moment is when the learner goes silent.
That's the crisis point. A subject asks the question that's hanging in the air. What if he's dead in there? The silence from the other room is just deafening. And the experimenter's response, not once we've started the experiment, is so cold, so bureaucratic, it denies reality. And the sources say that was often enough to get them to continue. It gave them permission to believe the system knew better than their own senses.
So how does the human mind do this? How does it bypass its own alarm system? The stress, the moral screaming, and flip that final switch? Milgram's primary explanation was this idea of the agentic state.
The agentic state is the absolute core of Milgram's theory. He argued that under the pressure of authority, a person undergoes what he called an agentic shift.
A shift.
Yes. You stop seeing yourself as an autonomous actor who makes moral choices. Instead, you transfer that moral burden to the authority figure. You see yourself as just an agent, an instrument carrying out someone else's will.
You're not the pilot anymore. You're just part of the autopilot system.
That's a perfect analogy. You're still flipping the switches, but the responsibility for where the plane is going, that now belongs to the captain. You've handed over your moral autonomy to the man in the gray coat.
And the transcripts show the exact moment this shift happens for many of them.
They do. It's when the subjects reach their breaking point and they ask, who is responsible if anything happens to him? And the experimenter replies with total confidence, I am responsible.
And what happens then?
You see it in the notes. The subjects visibly relax. Some would sigh in relief, and then they would continue. They found their out. They were no longer a torturer. They were just an employee following an order.
Beyond that internal shift, What were the structural things, the binding factors, that made it so hard for people to just get up and walk out?
Well, there were a few really powerful social constraints. First, you have the initial social contract. You agreed to participate, you took the money, you feel an obligation to see it through.
It's incredible to think that it's easier to administer 450 volts than to commit the social crime of being rude to a Yale researcher.
It speaks to the immense power of just social etiquette. And second, it's really hard to define the exact moment to break the rules. Disobedience means causing a scene, challenging the authority of this whole prestigious institution.
And the escalation, the fact that it's only 15 volts more each time.
That's the foot-in-the-door technique, but applied to violence. It's almost impossible to get someone to jump straight to 450 volts, but to go from 405 to 420, it just feels like a continuation of what you've already been doing. To stop at, say, 330, you have to admit that everything you did up to that point was also wrong. And that's a huge psychological burden.
So to cope with that, they used these strain-reducing mechanisms. How did they rationalize what they were doing in the moment?
They used a few classic strategies. Denial was a big one. Subjects would start questioning if the shocks were even real, suggesting the screams were fake. Then there was devaluation, blaming the victim. They'd say things like, well, he volunteered for this, he should have known.
And that gets us right back to the 𝐏𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓, the desk murderers.
It's a direct parallel. The subjects would often start focusing intently on the technical details of the task-making. Sure, they read the word pairs perfectly, following the procedure to the letter. It was a way to avoid thinking about the human consequence. Obsess over the process to ignore the outcome. That is the banality of evil in action.
Now, there is a more modern, more nuanced take on this, the engaged followership theory. This pushes back on the idea that they were just mindless robots.
Right. Researchers like Haslam and Riker, they argue that obedience is almost never mindless. They suggest that subjects obey because they actively identify with the authority and with the mission, in this case, the greater good of advancing science.
So it's kind of misguided idealism.
Exactly. It's an active choice, a twisted moral choice, to serve the abstract goal over the concrete person in the next room.
Which is almost more frightening. It means compliance isn't just weakness, it's an active decision. Is there evidence for this in Milgram's own data?
There is, and it's fascinating. It has to do with those 4 prods. If the subjects were just mindless agents, then prod 4, you have no other choice, should have been the most powerful command.
But it wasn't.
It wasn't. In fact, obedience often dropped when prod 4 was used, and the question is why? Well, it's because that blunt command shattered the illusion that they were partners in a noble scientific cause. It revealed the relationship for what it was, pure coercion. And when that happened, it often triggered resistance. They wanted to believe they were serving science, not just being bossed around.
Before the study, Milgram actually polled Yale psychiatrists and students about what they thought would happen.
And they got it spectacularly wrong. They predicted that only a tiny sadistic fringe, about 1.2%, would go all the way to 450 volts.
They just assumed that a person's individual conscience would win out, that the screams and the heart condition would be a universal stop sign.
They catastrophically underestimated the power of the situation. The baseline results were a shock to everyone. 100% of participants went to at least 300 volts, the point where the learner goes silent.
And the big number.
65%. 26 out of 40 people went all the way to 450 volts, shocking a silent victim 3 times in a row with the XXX switch.
But Milgram didn't stop there. He ran, 18 different variations? Each one was like a plot twist, designed to see what, if anything, could break the authority's spell.
This is where we really get into the weeds of the situational factors. He started tweaking the variables to see how conditional morality really is.
So let's talk about the physical relationship between the authority and the subject. What happened in the remote authority variation when the experimenter gave orders over the phone?
The drop was huge. Obedience plummeted from 65% down to 20.5%. That proves that the physical presence of the authority figure is a major binding factor. It's harder to disobey someone who is standing right next to you.
And many of them cheated.
Right. A lot of them cheated. They would tell the experimenter on the phone that they were increasing the voltage, but they were actually just giving the lowest shock over and over, which shows they were still morally conflicted, but they only felt safe to resist when the authority wasn't watching.
So what about the relationship between the teacher and the victim? The touch proximity variation.
This one is brutal. The teacher is now in the same room as the learner, and at 150 volts, the experimenter orders the teacher to physically grab the learner's hand and force it down onto the shock plate. This is direct physical violence.
And even with that, I mean, that's so extreme. How did obedience hold up?
It was reduced, but it was still shockingly high. 30% of participants complied. They physically forced the man's hand onto the plate, which shows that even direct physical contact didn't completely break the agentic state for a third of the people.
Okay, so what if you fracture the authority itself, the variation where two experimenters disagree?
This one completely shattered the command structure. You have two experimenters in the room, both in gray coats. At the 150-volt mark, one says, "We have to stop, he's in pain." The other one insists, "No, the experiment requires that we continue."
So the authority is no longer unified.
And obedience drops to 0. Not a single subject continued when the chain of command was broken. It proves that people are obeying the system, the unified structure, not just the person. When the system cracks, their conscience immediately reasserts itself.
That's powerful. What about the power of peer pressure, but in the other direction? The hero scenario.
The social support variation. This is arguably the most important one. The real subject is joined by two other teachers who are actually Confederates. At 150 volts, the first Confederate stands up, says, "I can't do this," and walks out. At 210 volts, the second one does the same.
So now the subject is alone, but they've just seen two people rebel.
And it changes everything. Obedience plummeted to just 10%. Seeing peers resist gave them the psychological permission and support they needed to follow their own conscience. It shows collective resistance is the most effective antidote to blind obedience.
And finally, what about the prestige of the institution? Did it have to be at Yale?
He tested that. He moved the whole operation to a rundown office in Bridgeport, called it Research Associates of Bridgeport. He deliberately removed the Yale name, and obedience did drop, but only slightly, to 47.5%.
So it wasn't just about Yale.
It wasn't just Yale. It was the authority of science itself as an abstract concept that was driving the compliance.
The scary thing is, this isn't just a historical artifact from the 60s. These dynamics play out in the real world all the time.
Horrifyingly so. The lab was a mirror, not an island. And one of the most chilling modern examples is the 2004 McDonald's strip search hoax.
It's a perfect Milgram replication in the most mundane setting you can imagine.
It's unbelievable. A caller, posing as Officer Scott, phones a McDonald's in Kentucky and tells the assistant manager, Donna Summers, that a young employee, Louise Ogborn, is a theft suspect.
And over the next 3 hours, he gives a series of escalating instructions over the phone, culminating in a strip search and sexual assault, carried out by the manager and her fiancé.
And you just look at the Milgram parallels. First, the caller has no actual power, only the voice of authority, just like the remote experimenter. Second, the incremental escalation is textbook. It went from checking her pockets to removing her clothes to demanding horrific physical acts. Each step made the next one seem possible.
And the justification from the manager?
Exactly the same. "I was just following orders." They said they were scared of this higher authority. They entered a complete agentic state, handing all moral responsibility to an anonymous voice on the phone. It proves the bad barrel can be anywhere, even a fast food office.
Another powerful real-world echo is the torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib in 2004.
Right. When these photos came out, the immediate response from the military was the bad apple theory, that this was just a few rogue, sadistic soldiers.
But psychologists like Philip Zimbardo argued it wasn't about bad apples, it was a bad barrel.
It was a situational, Milgram-esque environment. You had soldiers under extreme stress with a lack of clear guidance and a command structure that was vaguely encouraging them to soften up prisoners. That combination of hierarchy, stress, and the dehumanization of the enemy created a powerful agentic state where ordinary people did monstrous things.
Which brings us to the final critical question. Has anything changed? Are we any different today? A full replication is impossible now for ethical reasons, but Jerry Berger did a partial one in 2009.
Berger's approach was clever. He hypothesized that the 150-volt mark, the point where the learner first screams about his heart condition, was the real moral crossroads. He figured if a subject was willing to go past that point, they were functionally committed to going all the way. So he got ethical approval to run the experiment, but stop it right at 150 volts.
So he's testing that point of no return with modern subjects. What did he find?
The results were terrifying. 70% of Berger's participants were willing to continue past the 150-volt mark. The statistical analysis showed no significant difference between the obedience rates in 1961 and 2009.
So after decades of education about the Holocaust, about Milgram, about the dangers of blind obedience, nothing has changed.
The human propensity to enter the agentic state appears to be stubbornly, frighteningly consistent.
So let's tie this all together. What the Milgram experiment does is it holds up a mirror. It just strips away this comforting idea we have that we're all fundamentally autonomous and moral, and it reveals the frightening fragility of our conscience when it's put up against a powerful social structure.
It's the empirical proof of Arendt's banality thesis. The greatest horrors aren't necessarily committed by monsters, but by ordinary people, by functionaries who just surrender their ability to think critically. They focus on the technical demands of this system instead of the human consequences of their actions.
And the most profound part of it, I think, is the distress. The seizures, the trembling, the pleading. It proves they knew what they were doing was wrong. The horror isn't that they didn't care. The horror is that knowing it was wrong wasn't enough to make them stop.
That's the whole psychological drama. It's in that moment of hesitation, when the teacher looks at the switch labeled XXX and then looks at the impassive face of the man in the gray coat and then decides to press it because the system has given them permission. The capacity for that decision, for flipping the XXX switch, exists in all of us.
The agentic state is like a trapdoor in the human mind. It's just waiting for the right combination of authority, ideology, and situational pressure to spring open. The lab wasn't some strange, isolated event. It was a reflection of us.
And that leaves us with this one final provocative thought, and it comes from Milgram's most hopeful variation. He showed us that the best defense we have against malevolent authority is collective resistance. When those two peers refuse to continue, obedience dropped to 10%. So if the greatest danger is surrendering your own thinking to a system, the greatest defense is finding others to share the burden of conscience. The question we should be asking when faced with an unjust demand is not, can I stop, but who will stand up with me?